Our 12-year anniversary dinner. I got up to pay the bill. Walking back, I heard my wife tell another man I'd just quietly disappear. She was already building a future with someone the whole city admired. What she never saw coming was that I'd been dismantling hers piece by piece. My name is Colton Holloway. I'm 42 years old. I'm the technical director of a small engineering firm outside of Columbus, Ohio. I've spent the last 12 years married to a woman named Carla. And for most of those years, I genuinely believed we were solid. Not perfect, no marriages, but solid. The kind of couple that weathers storms and comes out the other side still standing. 12 years. That's not nothing. The dinner was my idea. Our anniversary was on a Thursday, and I'd booked Meridian, the kind of place with low lighting, linen tablecloths, and a sommelier who actually knows what he's talking about. I'd called ahead and arranged for a small bouquet of dahlias, Carla's favorite, to be on the table when we arrived. I wore the charcoal jacket she once said made me look like I had my life together. She wore a burgundy dress I hadn't seen before. We were doing fine, or so I believed. She laughed at something I said about a project at work. We shared a bottle of Malbec. She held my hand across the table and told me 12 years felt like nothing. I smiled and meant it. I was still that foolish. Midway through the main course, I excused myself. Our server had mentioned the dessert menu included a chocolate torte Carla had been eyeing since we sat down, and I wanted to pay the bill early so we could leave on our own terms. No waiting, no awkward card fumbling at the end. Romantic, I thought. Thoughtful. That was me. Always trying. I settled up at the host stand near the back, left a generous tip, and started back toward our table. That's when I heard it. The booth just around the corner from ours. A laugh. Carla's laugh, but not the version I knew. Not the polite, measured one she used at dinner parties or the tired one she gave me when I tried to be funny after a long day. This one was loose, unguarded, real, in a way it hadn't been with me in a long time. I stopped. A man's voice, low and comfortable, said something I didn't fully catch. Then Carla replied, and her words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Colton? He'll just disappear quietly. That's what he does. He doesn't make scenes. More laughter. Then, this is the last anniversary dinner I'm going to sit through. I stood there in the narrow corridor between the host stand and the dining room, one hand resting lightly against the wall. A server passed me with a tray, and I stepped aside automatically, as if everything was completely normal, as if my entire marriage hadn't just rearranged itself in the span of 15 seconds. I didn't recognize the man's voice, but I knew it wasn't a stranger. The familiarity in it, the ease, the shared joke quality, that takes time to build. I walked back to the table, sat down, picked up my wine glass. Everything okay? Carla asked, tilting her head with a small smile. Perfect, I replied, keeping my voice even. They said the torte's exceptional tonight. She lit up and reached for the dessert menu. I watched her and tried to match the woman in front of me with the voice I'd just heard around the corner. They fit together with terrible precision. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask. I didn't let a single thing show on my face. 12 years of being the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't make scenes. Turns out that training had a use after all. She was right that I'd disappear. She just had the version of me completely wrong. We finished dessert. She talked about maybe taking a long weekend somewhere before the weather turned. I nodded and said that sounded nice. I drove us home. I watched her take off her earrings in the bathroom mirror, hum something quietly, and go to bed without a second look in my direction. I sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning with a glass of water I didn't drink, running the voice through my head over and over, trying to place it. By the time I went to bed, I had made exactly one decision. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I was going to disappear completely, on my own terms in my own time, and in a way Carla would spend years trying to understand. She had no idea what she just started. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay on my side of the bed listening to Carla breathe and ran the math on 12 years of my life like a man auditing a company he suddenly suspected of fraud. Every quiet dinner, every business trip she took that I never questioned, every time she came home just slightly off, a little too relaxed, a little too vague about her day. I'd filed all of it under marriage going through a phase. Turns out I've been filing things in the wrong drawer for a long time. By 5 in the morning I was in the kitchen, coffee in hand, staring out at the backyard. The neighbor's dog was barking at something in the tree line. I watched the sky go from black to gray and made myself a promise. No explosions, no accusations, no begging. Whatever I did next, I was going to do it right. First thing I needed was information. Real information, not gut feelings and overheard fragments. I called Curtis Malone that morning, told him I needed to talk. Curtis and I had been friends since our mid-20s. He ran a cybersecurity consulting firm now, and was one of those people who knew exactly how much of the world ran on unprotected data. We met at a diner halfway between our offices, a place with good coffee and booths far enough apart that nobody could hear your business. I laid it out plainly, told him what I'd heard at the restaurant, told him I needed to know who the man was and what was going on, and I needed it documented. Curtis didn't flinch. He just wrapped both hands around his mug and asked, "How far do you want to go with this?" "Far enough to know the truth," I told him. "Not so far that I'm doing something I can't defend later." He nodded slowly. "There are ways. Legal ones. Give me a couple of days." 2 days later, Curtis had set up discreet monitoring software on a spare tablet I handed over and showed me how to access GPS data from Carla's phone through an app she'd already installed for family location sharing, one she'd stopped checking months ago. He also swept our home network and found something that made my stomach drop, a secondary messaging app installed on her phone, synced to an account I'd never seen. I didn't confront her. I watched. What came back over the following week was worse than I'd imagined and exactly what I'd feared. Late-night messages to a contact saved only as location pings at a downtown hotel on 2 separate Tuesday afternoons. A forwarded email confirmation for a weekend reservation at a lodge outside the city. 2 guests, billed to a card I'd never seen before. Then Curtis found the name attached to the other account. Stuart Ashby. I sat with that name for a long time. Stuart Ashby wasn't just anybody in Columbus. He was the kind of man whose name got put on buildings. He developed 2 shopping centers on the east side of the city and bankrolled the construction of a charter school out in Westerville that got written up in the local paper 3 times. He showed up at charity galas. He gave speeches at Chamber of Commerce lunches. He was exactly the kind of man who could make a woman feel like she was trading up. He was also 51 years old, recently divorced, and had apparently been in my wife's life long enough to know exactly how she thought I'd react to all of this. Quietly disappear. That's what she told him. I pulled up everything I could find on Ashby, public records, business filings, property holdings. Curtis helped me go deeper. What we found in those filings wasn't scandalous on its face, but there were gaps. LLC structures that didn't quite add up. A contractor dispute that had been settled quietly. A zoning variance that moved suspiciously fast through the city approval process. Nothing I could act on yet, but enough to know there was more underneath. I saved everything to an encrypted folder on a drive I kept in my office. That same week, I made an appointment with Irene Parrish. She was a divorce attorney with a reputation for being methodical and utterly unsentimental. Exactly what I needed. I walked in her office on a Wednesday afternoon and put my evidence folder on her desk without preamble. She reviewed it for 20 minutes while I sat across from her and said nothing. Finally, she looked up and said, "You've been thorough." "I'm an engineer," I replied. "I don't present findings until I have data." A faint smile crossed her face. "Smart. Don't move any joint assets yet. Not until I tell you. And don't tip her off. The longer she thinks everything is normal, the better your position when this goes to court." I drove home that evening and made dinner. Carla came in around 7, kicked off her shoes by the door, and asked what smelled good. I told her I made pasta. She sat at the kitchen island and talked about a difficult client meeting while I stirred sauce and listened and responded in all the right places. She had no idea that the man standing at her stove had spent the last week quietly building the case that would dismantle the life she was planning without him. She thought she was buying time. She was actually running out of it. Irene Parrish had given me one instruction above all others. Don't tip her off. So I didn't. I went to work, came home, made conversation, watched football on Sundays, and acted like a man who had no idea his marriage was a stage set. Meanwhile, everything I was learning got cataloged, dated, and saved to the encrypted drive I kept locked in my desk at the office. Curtis had been digging into the messaging app for 2 weeks when he flagged something that stopped me cold. He called me on a Tuesday evening while Carla was at her book club, or wherever she actually was on Tuesday evenings, and said, "Colton, I need you to sit down before I tell you this." I was already sitting at my kitchen table. "Just say it." The earliest message I can recover in that secondary account dates back 4 years, and 7 months ago. A pause. But the account itself was created 6 years ago. 6 years. We've been married 12. That meant this hadn't started as a midlife drift or a moment of weakness. It had started when William was 11 years old, when Carla and I had just finished paying off the second car, when I thought we were finally hitting our stride. I set the phone down on the table and stared at the wall for a long time. I'd always known, somewhere in the back of my mind, that Carla hadn't married me for the reasons I'd married her. She'd been careful about it. Never cruel, never obviously calculating. But there were moments over the years when I'd catch something in her expression that didn't quite fit the scene. A flicker of assessment. A pause before affection. I'd always talk myself out of what I was seeing. Curtis's next call came 3 days later and hit even harder. He traced the financial threads further back and found transfers. Modest at first, then growing, from a joint savings account we'd opened when William started high school, supposedly for his college fund. Over 18 months, nearly $40,000 had moved in small increments to an account I'd never seen. An account in Carla's name only, opened at a credit union across town. $40,000. Gone. My money, built from years of early mornings and late nights at the firm, quietly redirected toward whatever future she was constructing without me. I called Irene the next morning. "That changes things significantly," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction of a professional who'd just been handed a stronger hand. Financial misrepresentation of that scale gives us real leverage. Don't touch that account. Don't let on that you know it exists. Understood. And, Colton, start building a parallel financial picture. Quietly. Nothing that requires her signature. That afternoon, I opened a private checking account at a bank I'd never used before, on a side of Columbus I rarely visited. I transferred enough liquid assets to give myself runway without triggering anything obvious. Then I sat in the bank parking lot for 10 minutes afterward, watching people walk past the ATM, thinking about the man I was becoming. Methodical. Contained. Dangerous in a way I'd never needed to be before. I was okay with it. Stuart Ashby had a profile that was hard to miss if you lived in Columbus. 2 shopping centers on the east side, a charter school in Westerville with his family name above the entrance, and a habit of showing up in the local business journal every time he broke ground on something new. He was the kind of man who cultivated the appearance of generosity the way other men cultivated stock portfolios, strategically, with one eye always on the return. I'd met him twice in person. Once at a chamber event about 4 years ago, once at a neighborhood fundraiser the following year. Both times Carla had been with me. Both times I'd thought nothing of it. Now I was thinking plenty. Curtis had pulled Ashby's business filings at my request and spent a week going through them with the kind of patience that only someone who genuinely enjoys finding buried things can sustain. What he surfaced was interesting. 2 of Ashby's LLCs had the same registered agent, a small law firm that also happened to represent 3 city council members. A zoning variance on his second shopping center had moved through the approval process in 11 days. The city average for comparable applications was 4 to 6 months. That's not luck, Curtis told me over coffee. That's access. Can we document it? Already am. Public records, cross-referenced with campaign donation filings. He slid a folder across the table. It's not a smoking gun yet, but it's the kind of thing that gets interesting when it lands on the right desk. I took the folder. I wasn't sure yet what desk that would be, but I filed the information away with the same care I gave everything else. In my experience, leverage has a way of revealing its purpose when the moment arrives. What I discovered about Ashby personally was equally illuminating. He'd been divorced for 2 years, a settlement that, according to court records, had been contentious and expensive. His ex-wife had accused him of hiding assets through one of the LLCs. She'd been partially right, according to what Curtis found, but hadn't had the documentation to fully prove it. I had better documentation, and a much clearer motive to use it. The personal dimension hit me one evening when I was going through Carla's synced calendar, something she still hadn't thought to unlink from the family tablet. There was a recurring blocked slot every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, labeled PT, for what I'd always assumed was physical therapy for the shoulder she'd strained 2 years ago. I checked the GPS data against those slots. She hadn't been anywhere near a physical therapy clinic in 4 months. What I also found on that calendar, buried in a note attached to a Thursday entry, was a fragment of a message she'd apparently copy-pasted. W knows. Don't worry. He won't say anything to see. W. William. My stepson. 17 years old. A kid I'd coached through 2 years of junior varsity baseball, helped with college application essays, driven to school on early mornings when he missed the bus. A kid who apparently knew what his mother was doing and had decided that my feelings about it weren't worth the conversation. I closed the tablet and set on the desk carefully, the way you set something down when your hands want to do something else entirely. I didn't confront William that night. I wasn't ready. But I made a note, literal and mental, that when the time came, that conversation was going to happen on my terms, not anyone else's. Carla thought she had her household aligned, thought everyone was playing for her team. She'd forgotten something important. I was the one who'd built the team. There's a particular skill set required to live 2 lives simultaneously. You have to compartmentalize completely, not just emotionally, but logistically. Calendar discipline, consistent cover stories, the ability to sit across a dinner table from someone and perform warmth while your mind is somewhere else entirely. Carla had been doing it for 6 years. I've been doing it for about 3 weeks, and I was already exhausted. The difference was that my version had a finish line. Irene had advised me to keep my behavior at home absolutely unchanged, and I was following that instruction to the letter. I still cooked on the nights I usually cooked. I still asked about Carla's day. I still watched the news in the living room and offered commentary she either agreed with or ignored, the same as always. From the outside, we were a couple in the comfortable middle distance of a long marriage. Not passionate, not troubled, just steady. Inside, I was documenting everything. The encrypted drive in my office now held a structured folder system, financial records, GPS logs, screenshots of the messaging app organized by date. A running timeline Curtis had helped me build that cross-referenced Carla's stated locations against her actual ones. 18 months of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons that had nothing to do with physical therapy. 6 hotel stays, documented with date, location, and duration. The transfers from the college savings account, traced and confirmed. I'd also quietly opened accounts at 2 separate banks, transferred half our liquid assets under Irene's guidance, and begun the process of removing my name from joint credit lines we'd accumulated over the years. Irene had been clear, do it incrementally, do it legally, do it now. What I hadn't yet done was deal with William. That changed on a Wednesday evening in October. Carla was at her sister's, genuinely. I confirmed it on the GPS, and William was home, doing homework at the kitchen table with his earbuds in. I made 2 mugs of coffee, set one in front of him, and pulled out the chair across from him. He looked up, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the recognition of something he'd been waiting for. I reached over and gently pulled one earbud out. I need to talk to you. He didn't pretend not to know what it was about. That told me everything. He just set his pencil down and sat back in his chair, arms crossed loosely, looking at the table. How long? I asked quietly. A long pause. Then, about a year. Maybe a little more. Did she ask you not to tell me? He looked up then, and the conflict on his face was real. He wasn't a bad kid. He was a 17-year-old who'd been handed an impossible situation by his mother. She said it was complicated, that she'd handle it. She didn't handle it, William. I know. His voice was low. I kept my tone even, because the anger I felt wasn't at him, and I wasn't going to let it land on him. I'm not blaming you. I understand the position she put you in, but I want you to understand something. What's happening in this house isn't your fault, and it isn't your responsibility to manage. It never was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What are you going to do?" "Take care of it," I said simply. "The right way." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask for details, which was probably wise on his part. We finished our coffee mostly in silence. But before I got up, he said, without looking at me, "For what it's worth, I always thought you were a good stepfather." I let that sit there. Then I stood up, squeezed his shoulder once, and went back to my office. The conversation with William had confirmed 2 things. 1. Carla had been managing her household like a project manager, assigning roles and distributing information on a need-to-know basis. 2. Not everyone she'd pulled into her orbit was as committed to the deception as she was. That gave me something to work with. Curtis called the following week with an update on the Ashby financial thread. He found a 3rd LLC, this one registered in Delaware, that appeared to be the vehicle through which the zoning variance payment had moved, not directly, but through a chain of consulting fees paid to an intermediary with no apparent consulting practice. The total amount was $112,000, routed across 14 months. "That's not a political donation," Curtis said. "That's a bribe wrapped in paperwork. Can you document the chain end to end?" "Already halfway there. Give me 10 more days." I gave him the 10 days. And on the Friday, he delivered the complete file. I made a copy, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote a single name and address on the front. A journalist at the Columbus Dispatch who covered local government and had broken 2 corruption stories in the past 18 months. I didn't include a return address. I dropped in a mailbox 3 miles from my office on my way to an early lunch. I didn't know exactly when it would land or what she'd do with it. But I knew Stuart Ashby's carefully constructed civic reputation was now operating on borrowed time. And I hadn't raised my voice once. November came in cold and gray, and Carla started doing something I hadn't expected. She started paying attention to me. Not the real kind. I understood that now, with uncomfortable clarity. But the performed kind, the strategic kind. She brought home dinner twice without being asked. She initiated a conversation about a weekend trip to Cincinnati, somewhere we'd talked about visiting for years. She asked me one evening, in a voice that was carefully calibrated to sound casual, whether I'd been feeling distant lately. I looked up from the report I'd been reviewing. "Just work stress," I told her. "The Denton project's been eating my calendar." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and went back to her book. But she kept watching me after that, small glances over meals, an extra attentiveness that had the quality of someone monitoring an experiment. She could sense something had shifted. She just couldn't locate it. Good. What she didn't know was that I'd already done the most important thing. I'd found a furnished apartment across town, in a neighborhood I'd always liked, and signed a 6-month lease under my own name. Paid the deposit in cash from the new account. The lease started December 1st. I had my exit ready. I just needed the right moment to use it. Irene and I met twice in November. The second meeting, she walked me through a strategy one found genuinely elegant. Carla had her eye on the investment property we'd purchased together 4 years ago, a duplex in Clintonville that generated steady rental income and had appreciated nicely. She'd mentioned it twice in casual conversation over the past 2 months, always with the same slightly too casual framing. Irene suggested I allow Carla to believe the duplex was her primary target. Offer it to her early in the proceedings, Irene explained. Let her feel like she won something. While she's focused on the duplex, she won't be looking at the engineering firm's retained equity stake, which is worth 3 times as much and is structured in a way that's difficult for her to claim. I understood immediately. Give up the visible piece. Protect the real asset. She'll take the duplex, I said. They always do, Irene replied. Curtis, meanwhile, had confirmed that the Dispatch journalist had received the envelope. He'd found a vague reference to a new investigation in her recent Twitter activity, just enough to know the information had landed. Whatever happened next with Ashby was no longer in my hands. I'd lit the fuse and stepped back. What was still in my hand was the conversation I hadn't yet had with Carla. I'd been rehearsing it for weeks, not the emotional version, not what I wanted to say, but the strategic version. The confrontation needed to happen on specific terms. After I'd moved the last of my personal items, after the apartment was ready, after the divorce papers were filed and ready to serve. Not a moment before. The trigger came on a Saturday evening when Carla told me she was going to a gallery opening with a friend named Diane. I checked the GPS from my office the next morning. She'd been at a hotel downtown for 4 hours. Same hotel as twice before. I saved the log, updated the timeline, and noted the date. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I called a woman named Brooke Sinclair. Brooke was 38, a structural engineer I'd worked with on a joint project 18 months ago. Sharp, funny, straightforward in the way people are when they've been through enough to stop pretending. We'd always gotten along well. After the project ended, we'd stayed in touch loosely, the occasional check-in. Nothing more. I called her and asked if she wanted to grab coffee that week. Nothing complicated, no agenda. Just the desire to sit across from someone who was exactly who they said they were. She said yes without hesitation. We met at a place near the university on a Tuesday morning. We talked for 2 hours about work, about a renovation she was managing on her house, about a book she'd been trying to finish for 3 months. She made me laugh twice without trying. I walked back to my car, afterward feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I could accurately measure. Like myself, I wasn't looking for a replacement. I wasn't looking for anything. But that morning reminded me that the life I was methodically rebuilding had actual room in it. For conversation, for laughter, for the kind of ease that I'd apparently been living without for years without fully registering the loss. I drove back to the office, updated 2 project files, and spent the rest of the afternoon working with the focused, clean energy of a man who finally knew exactly where he was going. December arrived, and I started moving pieces off the board. The apartment on Fairfield Avenue had been ready since the first of the month. A clean 2-bedroom in a building I'd chosen specifically because nobody I knew lived within 4 blocks of it. I'd furnished it gradually, 1 carload at a time on mornings when Carla was at the gym. Books I'd been missing for years. The good coffee maker she claimed as hers when we reorganized the kitchen. My grandfather's tackle box that had been sitting in the garage since we moved in. The things that were mine, and only mine, relocated quietly to the place I was already beginning to think of as home. Irene and I met on a Tuesday morning, and she walked me through the final structure of the filing. The divorce papers were drafted, signed on my end, and ready to serve. She'd reviewed the full evidence package, the GPS logs, the financial transfer trail, the hotel receipts, the screenshot archive from the messaging app, and characterized it as one of the cleaner cases she'd handled in terms of documentation. She's going to contest the financial claims, Irene told me, sliding the folder back across the desk. But contesting them requires explaining them, and she can't explain them without confirming the affair. She'll be arguing against herself. What about the duplex? Irene allowed herself a small, measured smile. Offer it at the first mediation session. Frame it as a good faith gesture. She'll take it within 20 minutes. And the firm's equity stake. Properly structured as a premarital business asset with retained interest. She gets nothing there unless she wants to spend 2 years in litigation. She won't win. She paused. Don't let her attorney know you're aware of the college fund transfers until we're in the room. That's our second card. I drove back to the office and spent the afternoon in back-to-back project meetings. The most ordinary Tuesday, imaginable from the outside. Only Curtis knew what was actually in motion. He'd confirmed that the Columbus Dispatch journalist had begun making inquiries. A source at City Hall had mentioned being contacted for comment on something related to a commercial development company. Ashby's name hadn't appeared publicly yet, but the ground beneath him was already shifting in ways he couldn't see. That evening I came home, and Carla had made dinner. Lamb chops, roasted vegetables, a bottle of red she'd been saving. She'd set the table properly, which she hadn't done on an ordinary weeknight in years. She was dressed nicely. She'd done something with her hair. She was running a play. I watched her do it with something close to clinical detachment. Over dinner she talked about the new year, about how she wanted things to feel different between us, more connected, more intentional. She used the word intentional 3 times. She reached across the table and touched my hand and said she thought we'd both been too caught up in routines, that maybe we needed to shake things up. I kept my expression warm and open. I said I thought she was right. I said the new year felt like a good opportunity to reassess. She went to bed that night, looking satisfied with herself. I sat in the kitchen afterward and sent Irene a 1-word text. Thursday. Thursday morning, I was up at 5:30. I showered, dressed, and loaded the last 2 boxes from my home office into my car while it was still dark. The house was quiet. Carla slept until 7:30 on weekdays and never came downstairs before coffee. I left her coffee maker on the counter. She'd always considered it hers anyway. I drove to the office, handled 2 hours of work, and at 10 a.m. received confirmation from Irene's paralegal. Carla had been served at home at 9:47. Her signature on the receipt was described as shaky. I imagined that. Then I stopped imagining it and went back to work. Curtis called at noon. His voice had an edge to it that I recognized. The sound of a man who just confirmed something significant. The dispatch piece is running Sunday, he said. Front page of the business section. They've got the full LLC chain, the zoning payment, the intermediary connection. She called Ashby's office for comment yesterday, and his PR person spent 45 minutes on the phone with her, trying to talk her out of it. She ran it anyway. She's running it anyway. I thanked him and ended the call. The first message from Carla came at 11:15, while I was in a project meeting. I didn't look at it until I was back at my desk. What is this? Call me right now. The second one came 20 minutes later. Colton, I need to talk to you. Please. The third was longer, a paragraph about shock and not understanding and asking me to come home so we could talk. I replied to all three with one message. Everything you need to know is in the filing. Irene Parrish's contact information is on the cover page. She called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. What I hadn't anticipated, or rather, what I prepared for but hoped to avoid, was Carla showing up at my office. She arrived at 2:15. I know because my assistant called back to tell me. Her voice carefully neutral in the way it gets when she's reading a situation she doesn't want to editorialize on. I told her to send Carla in. Carla walked in my office, and she looked like a woman who'd spent 4 hours in freefall trying to find something to grab onto. Her composure was mostly intact. She was too controlled to come invisibly wrecked, but the edges were fraying in ways I could see clearly because I'd spent 3 months learning to read her with fresh eyes. She closed the door behind her and stood in the middle of the room. How long have you known? Sit down, Carla. She stayed standing. How long? Since the anniversary dinner, I said evenly. The booth around the corner from ours. You said I'd disappear quietly. I leaned back in my chair. You were partially right. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. More like the recalculation of someone who's realized the board doesn't look the way they thought it did. It isn't what you think, she started. I held up one hand. I have GPS data, financial records, hotel receipts, and a documented message archive going back 14 months. I've had all of it for weeks. So I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you're about to say next, because I have the receipts for most of it. The composure slipped then. Not dramatically. Carla wasn't a dramatic woman, but in the controlled, precise way of someone whose plan has just failed in a way they can't immediately route around. She sat down. The duplex, she said after a moment. I want the duplex. I know you do, I replied. My attorney will discuss it at mediation. And the savings. Your attorney will need to explain certain transfers before we discuss the savings. I watched that land. Her jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Specifically, approximately $40,000 moved from our joint account to an account at Westside Credit Union over an 18-month period. My attorney has the full trail. The silence in my office was total. Colton, we're done here, I said, not unkindly. This is a legal matter now. Everything goes through Irene. I stood up. I'll walk you out. She stood slowly, and for one moment, she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her in years. Something unguarded and almost searching, like she was trying to find the version of me she thought she knew. The one who would have crumbled. The one who would have begged or raged, or made a scene she could redirect. That version had been gone for 3 months. She just hadn't noticed his absence until now. I held the door open. She walked through it without another word. I watched her cross the parking lot from my window. She sat in her car for a long time before she drove away. Sunday morning, the Dispatch ran the story. Stuart Ashby's name appeared in the headline. The piece detailed the LLC structure, the zoning payment chain, the intermediary connection, and included a response from Ashby's spokesperson that confirmed, through its careful denials, that the allegations had substance. By Monday morning, 2 city council members had issued statements calling for a review of the approval process. By Wednesday, Ashby had retained a criminal defense attorney. Carla stopped contacting me directly after that. January in Columbus is the kind of cold that makes everything feel final. Gray sky, bare trees, the city stripped down to its bones. It suited me. I've been stripping things down for months, and I was almost done. Mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in neutral office downtown. A conference room with a round table, a moderator named Gerald Frost, who looked like he'd heard every version of every story, and 2 attorneys who'd been communicating through documents for 3 weeks. I arrived 10 minutes early, poured bad coffee into a paper cup, and sat with my hands flat on the table. Carla arrived with her attorney, a man named Philip Rhodes, who came in projecting the careful confidence of someone who'd reviewed the file and wasn't entirely happy with what he'd found. He and Carla took seats across from Irene and me. Carla looked composed. She'd dressed the way she dressed for important things, polished, deliberate, nothing out of place. She didn't look at me directly when she sat down. Gerald Frost opened with the standard language about good faith negotiation and voluntary resolution. Then he turned it over to the attorneys. Rhodes led with the house. Irene let him talk for 4 minutes, then laid the financial transfer documentation on the table. The full $40,000 trail from the joint savings account to Carla's private account at West Side Credit Union. She presented it without commentary, just slid the folder across and waited. Rhodes glanced at his client. Carla's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes recalibrated. "We're prepared to address those transfers," Rhodes said carefully. "I'm sure you are," Irene replied pleasantly. "We can address them in detail, or we can move on to a framework that accounts for them in the division structure. Your client's choice." The silence lasted about 8 seconds. Carla leaned slightly toward Rhodes and said something too quiet to hear. He nodded once. "We'd like to discuss the Clintonville property," Rhodes said. There it was. Right on schedule. I kept my face neutral and let Irene do her job. What followed was 40 minutes of careful negotiation that went almost exactly as Irene had mapped it. Carla's side pushed hard for the duplex. Irene offered it after a measured resistance, framing it as a significant concession. Rhodes accepted on Carla's behalf within the time frame Irene had predicted. The joint savings account was split with an adjustment reflecting the undocumented transfers. The house went to a structured equity split with a 12-month buyout window. The engineering firm's retained equity stake was never mentioned. Rhodes hadn't found it. I hadn't expected him to, but I prepared for the possibility. He hadn't. When Gerald Frost summarized the agreed terms and asked both parties to confirm, I looked across the table at Carla for the first time that morning. She was looking back at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not quite bitterness, not quite regret. Something more complicated than either. Like someone standing at a distance from a fire, they lit themselves, realizing it burned differently than they'd imagined. "Confirmed," I said. Outside, Irene shook my hand on the sidewalk. "Clean," she said simply. That was enough. I drove to the Fairfield apartment, changed out of my suit, and spent the rest of the afternoon moving the last few items in from a storage unit I'd rented back in October. It took 2 trips and a hand truck. By evening, the apartment felt like mine. Not staged, not temporary, but actually lived in. I made a proper dinner for the first time in weeks, something with actual effort behind it, and ate at my own table in my own space with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd fought a long, quiet battle and come out the other side with his integrity intact and his assets protected. Curtis called while I was washing up. "Ashby resigned from the charter school board this afternoon," he said. "Issued a statement about wanting to focus on addressing the allegations without distraction to the institution." How'd the statement land? About as well as you'd expect. The Business Journal's already running a follow-up piece. A pause. He's not done, but he's bleeding. I thanked Curtis, hung up, and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below. Stuart Ashby had spent years building a civic image that gave him cover for the kind of arrangements that benefited no one but himself. That image was coming apart on its own now, thread by thread, because someone had put the right information in the right hands. I hadn't destroyed him. I'd just removed the protection. What he did with what remained was his problem. 4 months after mediation, I was sitting on the roof deck of the Fairfield building on a warm Saturday in May, coffee in one hand, watching the Columbus skyline, do nothing in particular. William had texted me that morning to say he'd been accepted to the engineering program at Ohio State. I texted back a single line, "That's earned. I'm proud of you." He'd sent back a thumbs up, and then, after a pause, a second message. "Thanks for everything, Colton." Seriously. I held on to that for a while. The divorce had been finalized in late February. The duplex was Carla's. The equity split on the house had been executed cleanly. My firm's retained stake, the asset Rhodes had never found to ask about, was fully intact and had appreciated another 8% since January. Irene had called the outcome one of the cleaner resolutions she'd managed in recent years. I'd sent her a bottle of good bourbon by way of thanks. Stuart Ashby's situation had continued to deteriorate at a pace that required no input from me. The Columbus Dispatch investigation had prompted a formal city council inquiry. 2 of his commercial tenants had publicly renegotiated lease terms, citing uncertainty about the property's ownership structure. His charter school had brought in interim leadership. By March, there were reports that a grand jury had been seated to examine the zoning approval process. Carla had been quiet since mediation. No direct contact, no attempts to relitigate through mutual acquaintances. She'd moved into the duplex and, according to Curtis's last update, had not been seen publicly with Ashby in weeks. Whether their arrangement survived the public unraveling of his reputation was not something I spent time thinking about. That was their math to do. Brooke and I had started seeing each other properly in March. Not rushed, not dramatic. Just two people who liked each other's company and kept finding reasons to extend it. She was straightforward in a way I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. She said what she meant. She didn't perform. On our third proper date, she told me bluntly that she had no patience for games and no interest in anything that wasn't real. And I'd looked at her across the table and thought, finally. We weren't putting labels on it yet. We didn't need to. One evening in April, I'd been driving back from a site visit when I passed Meridian, the restaurant where Carla and I had our last anniversary dinner. I didn't slow down. Didn't feel the pull to stop or to reconstruct the memory or to measure the distance between who I'd been that night and who I was now. I just drove past it and turned up the radio. I realized what actual healing felt like. Not a ceremony, not a resolution speech, just a Tuesday evening where a place that used to mean something now meant nothing at all, and the absence of meaning felt like freedom rather than loss. Carla had told Stuart Ashby that I'd disappear quietly. She'd said it with the casual certainty of someone who thought they knew exactly what kind of man they'd married. She was right that I disappeared. Wrong about every other detail. I didn't disappear into bitterness or self-destruction or a long decline. I disappeared from a life that had been built on a foundation I hadn't known was hollow, and I reappeared somewhere else entirely. A better apartment, a cleaner financial position, a real connection with a woman who'd never once looked at me like I was something to be managed. The version of me who sat at that anniversary table and drove home in silence, already building a plan. That man knew something the old version of me hadn't. He knew that quiet doesn't mean weak. That patience isn't the same as passivity. That the most devastating thing you can do to someone who underestimates you is simply to prove them wrong. I proved her wrong. And on that May morning on the roof deck, with William's text still on my screen and Brooke's name in my call log from the night before, I was done looking back.